She fired him in front of his 8-year-old daughter. No warning, no dignity, no hesitation. Claire Whitmore, CEO of a billion-dollar empire, looked Marcus Reed dead in the eyes with his little girl standing right beside him clutching her purple backpack, and she told him to get out. 15 years. Gone in 30 seconds. And 60 minutes later, her entire building went dark. 23 people were trapped. The merger of the decade was collapsing, and the only man who could save everything was the one she had just destroyed. Drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this story travels. The morning Marcus Reed got fired started the same way every morning in his life started. With pancakes. Not the frozen kind. Not the kind that came out of a box with artificial maple flavoring and a cartoon character smiling from the packaging. Real pancakes. The kind his mother used to make when he was a boy in Baltimore. The kind where you had to watch the edges carefully, because the moment those little bubbles started forming across the surface, you had exactly 12 seconds to flip before the bottom burned. His mother had taught him that. She had taught him a lot of things. Patience, precision, the quiet dignity of doing something ordinary with extraordinary care. Marcus stood at the stove in his apartment on the 3rd floor of a modest building in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco, the Saturday morning light cutting through the kitchen window at an angle that made everything look softer than it was. The city outside was already stirring. He could hear the buses, the distant argument of pigeons on the fire escape, someone's music bleeding through the ceiling from upstairs. He had lived in this apartment for 9 years, long enough that the sounds had stopped being background noise and become something closer to company. "Daddy?" The voice came from the hallway, still thick with sleep. "In the kitchen, baby." Nia Reed appeared in the doorway, wearing an oversized t-shirt that reached her knees, her hair in 2 lopsided puffs that Marcus had done himself the night before, because she had a habit of pulling out whatever style he managed to put together by morning. She was 8 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, dark, wide, and devastatingly perceptive, the kind of eyes that looked at you and seemed to already know what you were about to say before you said it. "Pancakes?" she asked. "Blueberry." He reached into the bowl and dropped a handful of fresh berries into the batter. "You want to pour the OJ?" She climbed onto the step stool beside the refrigerator with the practiced ease of a child who had been doing it for years, pulled out the orange juice, and set it on the counter with both hands. She was careful about things like that. She took after him in that way. "You're coming with me today," Marcus said, watching the batter bubble. "To work?" She wrinkled her nose the way she always did when she was thinking about something she wasn't sure she liked. "Why can't I stay with Ms. Patricia?" "Ms. Patricia's daughter is visiting from Sacramento." He flipped the pancake cleanly. "Perfect. And you can't stay alone, so you're coming with me. You can sit in the break room, do your reading." "Will Mr. Delgado be there? He shows me card tricks." "Probably. But you are not going to bother him. Deal?" She considered this with the seriousness of a diplomat negotiating a treaty. "Deal. But only if there's hot chocolate in the break room machine." "There is." "Then deal." Marcus smiled and said nothing more. He slid the pancakes onto her plate, watched her pour an amount of syrup that he chose not to comment on, and sat across from her with his coffee and thought, not for the first time, that in a life that had not always been kind, this kitchen, this girl, these 12 seconds before the pancake burns, this was the thing that held everything together. Hartwell Tower stood 78 floors above the financial district of San Francisco, like a monument to the idea that scale was the same thing as strength, glass and steel and ambition forged into a single structure that you could see from across the bay on a clear day, catching the morning light and throwing it back at you in ways that made it look almost alive. It was the headquarters of Hartwell Capital Partners, one of the most powerful private equity and financial services firms on the West Coast. Founded 22 years ago by Gerald Hartwell, who had died of a stroke 4 years back and left the company to his chosen successor, the firm managed over $90 billion in assets, employed nearly 4,000 people across 3 continents, and was, according to the most recent issue of Forbes magazine, sitting on the cusp of the most significant merger in its history. The Vantage Capital deal. $11 billion. 18 months of negotiation. 2 teams of lawyers who had collectively billed more hours than most people worked in a lifetime. It was scheduled to close in less than 48 hours. and the woman responsible for making it happen was already in the building. Claire Whitmore had been CEO of Hartwell Capital for 3 years, elevated from chief operating officer by the board following Gerald Hartwell's death. She was 44 years old, precise in the way a surgical instrument was precise, and she had not built her reputation on warmth. She had built it on results, on restructuring underperforming divisions with a clarity that some people called vision and other people called ruthlessness, depending on whether they were on the winning side of the restructuring. She wore her dark hair back and her suits fitted, and her expression with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that emotion in a boardroom was a liability. She arrived at her office every morning at 6:45. Her assistant knew to have the briefing documents on her desk before 6:43. The 2-minute window was not accidental. It was designed so that Claire had exactly enough time to remove her coat, place her bag, and sit down before reading began. She did not like surprises. She did not like inefficiency. And she did not, as several former employees could confirm, respond well to problems she had been given insufficient notice to solve. That morning she was already seated and reading when her assistant, a thin young man named Kyle, who had worked for her for 14 months and was beginning to show the particular exhaustion that came from the job, knocked and entered simultaneously. "The Vantage team is confirming final document review for tomorrow, 2 p.m., Kyle said. "I know. And you have the infrastructure audit report on your 9 o'clock. I've read it." Kyle paused at the door. "There's also been another work order submitted by maintenance, Marcus Reed again. The cooling systems. Yes, ma'am, 3rd submission in 6 weeks. He's flagging what he calls a cascade vulnerability in the server floor HVAC integration. He says, Kyle." Claire turned a page. "How many engineers do we have on retainer for building systems?" 3 external firms. "And have any of them flagged this cascade vulnerability?" A pause. "No, ma'am." "Then what I have is 1 maintenance worker with a theory that contradicts 3 engineering firms." She looked up for the first time. "Schedule the debrief for 9:15 and tell legal I want the final Vantage security protocols on my desk by noon." Kyle nodded and withdrew. Claire returned to her documents. The work order went to the bottom of the stack. Marcus and Nia arrived at Hartwell Tower at 8:45. He addressed her in her school clothes out of habit. Navy blue pants, white shirt, her purple backpack that she refused to leave home without, under any circumstances. She walked beside him through the service entrance with the focused attention of a child determined to behave, which Marcus had learned over the years was sometimes more exhausting to manage than mischief, because it came with questions. "How tall is the building?" 78 floors. "How many people work here?" "In this building, about 1,200 on a workday." "Do they all know you?" Marcus considered this as he badged through the security checkpoint and nodded to the guard, a large quiet man named Carlos, who had worked the service entrance for 7 years, and who tapped 2 fingers to his temple at Nia like a salute. "Some of them," Marcus said. "Do you know all of them?" "Most." Nia seemed to file this away. "That's more than you," she said. Marcus looked at her. "What?" "Most people know more people than you do. You know most of them, but they don't all know you. That means you know more than you have back." He stopped walking and looked at his daughter for a moment, 8 years old. He could not always tell if she was being accidentally profound or deliberately testing him. With Nia, sometimes there was no difference. "That's a pretty grown-up thought," he said. She shrugged. "I just want to know if people are nice to you here." The question landed somewhere quiet and deep in Marcus's chest. He put his hand on her head briefly, the way he did when he didn't have an answer he was ready to give. "Come on," he said. "Mr. Delgado's going to show you that card trick." The break room on the 42nd floor was a comfortable space. Large windows overlooking the southern portion of the city, a bank of vending machines, a coffee station with a hot chocolate option that Nia had already correctly identified and was standing in front of with the kind of intense focus most adults reserved for contract negotiations. Marcus got her settled with her reading book and her hot chocolate, exchanged a few words with Hector Delgado, who was indeed there, and who had a new card trick that involved what he claimed was a mathematical impossibility, but was almost certainly just very fast hands, and then he went to work. His shift technically began at 9, but Marcus rarely arrived right on time, because arriving right on time meant you had not checked the overnight system logs, and the overnight system logs were where problems lived before they became disasters. He had learned this lesson in a different life. in a different building, in a different version of himself. One that wore a different title and made a significantly different salary, and had come to this exact building not as a maintenance worker, but as an electrical engineer contracted for what was supposed to be a 6-month systems review. That had been 15 years ago. The consulting contract had ended. His wife, Diana, had been 4 months pregnant, and then Diana had gotten sick. Not the kind of sick that passes. The other kind. The relentless, grinding kind that requires specialists and treatments and someone home every evening without exception. The engineering firm he worked for didn't offer that kind of flexibility. The maintenance position at Hartwell Tower did. Marcus had made the calculation the way he made all calculations. Clearly, without sentiment, and with complete certainty about what mattered most. He had taken the job. Diana had delivered Nia in a February snowstorm that was unusual for San Francisco, and had commented from the hospital bed in the way she always spoke about beautiful things, even when she was exhausted, that she thought it was a good sign. Snow in California, something rare and extraordinary happening on the day of their daughter's birth. She had died 11 months later. Marcus had stayed. He stayed because Nia needed stability, because the hours were reliable, because the job came with solid health benefits, and because, though he had never said this to anyone, he found something deeply grounding in the work itself, in the honesty of it. A building either worked or it didn't. A system either functioned or it was failing. There was no spin, no politics, no version of events that could be massaged into something more palatable. The building told the truth. Marcus respected that. He pulled up the system monitoring dashboard on the maintenance terminal in the basement operations center and began his review. The numbers were not good. They had not been good for 6 weeks, which was why he had submitted 3 work orders, each more detailed than the last, each describing with increasing specificity what he had come to believe was a serious and growing vulnerability in the integration between the server floor cooling systems and the building's central power management network. The two systems had been designed by different contractors at different times and were supposed to communicate through a bridge protocol that Marcus had identified during his first month on the job as architecturally fragile. It worked fine under normal conditions. But he had been watching for months as the load patterns shifted in ways that told him something was changing underneath the surface. Small fluctuations, micro delays in thermal response, feedback loops that were not supposed to exist. He had written it up in language that a non-engineer could understand. He had attached the data logs. He had sent it to his direct supervisor, to the facilities manager, and to the building systems coordinator. 3 times. 3 times it had come back with a note that the external engineering firms had reviewed the concern and found no actionable risk at the current time. Marcus stared at the dashboard. The numbers were worse than yesterday. He began drafting a 4th work order. The meeting on the 44th floor that morning had nothing to do with Marcus Reed. It was a security review for the Vantage merger. Standard protocol, the kind of comprehensive examination of building and network vulnerabilities that large financial transactions required before signing. 3 members of Claire's security team, the head of IT infrastructure, and the building's facilities manager, Gordon Pruitt, were seated around the table when Claire walked in at 9:14, 1 minute later than scheduled, which everyone in the room understood without being told was not because she had lost track of time. "Walk me through building security," Claire said, sitting without preliminary. The presentation was efficient, access logs were clean. The server rooms on floors 60 through 63 were showing nominal operations. External penetration testing had found no vulnerabilities. The building's physical security had been upgraded 18 months ago. "Maintenance staff?" Claire said. Gordon Pruitt, a broad-shouldered man with the permanently distracted expression of someone managing too many things, shifted in his chair. "All current staff have been background checked. There was 1 item flagged." He opened a folder. Marcus Reed. Night maintenance, 15 years tenure. He's been accessing server room corridors using override codes that were updated in the last security rotation. The codes he's using are 6 months out of date. How many times? 14 times in the past 30 days. Silence in the room. "Why does a maintenance worker need server room corridor access at all?" Claire said. "Thermal monitoring panels," one of the IT engineers said. "The cooling system readouts are physically located in those corridors. Standard maintenance access." "But he's using outdated codes." "Yes, ma'am." "Can anyone explain that?" No one could explain it satisfactorily. There were theories, administrative oversight in the code update notification, a breakdown in the facility's communication chain, the possibility that Reed had been given a temporary exception that was never properly documented. But in the context of an $11 billion merger closing in 48 hours, theories and possibilities were not the kind of language Claire Whitmore found reassuring. She looked at Gordon Pruitt. When does his shift start? 9. He's already in the building. Bring him up. Marcus was in the middle of annotating his 4th work order when the call came to his radio. Come to the 47th floor. Executive Conference Room 3. Now. He looked at the radio for a moment, then he looked at the data on the screen. He saved the document, locked the terminal, and picked up his radio. Before he left, he stopped by the 42nd floor break room. Nia was deep in her book, a story about a girl who could communicate with animals that she had read twice already and showed no signs of tiring of. Hector Delgado was across the table eating a sandwich and doing a crossword. "Hey," Marcus said, catching Hector's eye. "Can you keep an eye on her for 20 minutes? I got called upstairs." Hector nodded without asking questions. The way people who have worked long enough in large buildings learn not to ask questions when someone is called upstairs. 20 minutes, Marcus told Nia. She didn't look up from her book. "You said that last time and it was 40. 20 minutes, he said again. She turned a page. Conference room 3 on the 47th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows on the eastern wall, and on a clear morning like this one, you could see all the way to the Bay Bridge from where Marcus stood. He noticed this because he noticed things. He also noticed that there were 4 people in the room: Gordon Pruitt, 2 members of building security whose names he did not know, and at the head of the table, Claire Whitmore. He had seen Claire Whitmore perhaps a dozen times in 15 years. She moved through this building at a different altitude than he did. Her world was the executive floors, the boardrooms, the glass-walled offices where the city spread out beneath you like something you owned. She did not walk through the basement. She did not inspect thermal monitoring panels. She did not know, he suspected, that the building's cooling redundancy failsafe had been incorrectly configured since the last software update 8 months ago, a detail that he had included in his 3rd work order in what he now recognized, given the current atmosphere in this room, was probably too much technical specificity. "Mr. Reed," Claire said. Not a greeting, a designation. "Ms. Whitmore," he said. She looked at the folder in front of her and then back at him with the directness of someone who had decided before he walked through the door. "Our security review indicates that you've been accessing server room corridors using authorization codes that were invalidated 6 months ago, 14 documented instances in the last 30 days. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "The cooling system monitoring panels are in those corridors. I've been checking them manually because the automated readouts on the maintenance dashboard have been showing anomalies that I believe. Were you notified of the code update?" He paused. "I received the general notification. I flagged to my supervisor that I needed continued access to those corridors for monitoring purposes. I assumed the exception was..." "Assumed." Claire repeated the word without inflection, but the effect was precise. "You assumed, while accessing restricted server room corridors in the days before a major transaction, with invalidated codes." "Miss Whitmore." Marcus kept his voice even. He was very good at keeping his voice even. "I understand how it looks. I want to explain the reason for those visits because I believe what I've been observing in those cooling system metrics represents a serious risk to..." "Mr. Reed," Claire folded her hands on the table. "This company has 3 external engineering firms on retainer for building systems analysis. Those firms have reviewed your submitted concerns and found no actionable risk. What you have been doing for the past month is using unauthorized access codes to enter restricted areas of this building. I don't have any other way to characterize that." The room was very quiet. Marcus looked at her. He was not angry exactly. He was something older and more complicated than anger. He was the way a person looks when they have done everything correctly and watched it count for nothing. "The cooling systems are failing," he said. Not loudly. Quietly. With the precision of someone who has spent 15 years being careful with facts. "The integration bridge between the server floor HVAC and the central power management network has developed a feedback loop that I have documented extensively. If that loop isn't addressed, and if the server loads increase, which they will, during a major transaction, the thermal management system will fail. And if thermal management fails, the building's automated power distribution network will attempt an emergency load rebalance that it is not configured to handle correctly. The result will be a cascading failure across multiple systems simultaneously. Silence. Gordon Pruitt looked at his folder. One of the security men looked at the table. Claire looked at Marcus. Your employment with Hartwell Capital Partners is terminated, effective immediately, she said. Security will escort you from the premises. Your personal belongings will be couriered to you within 3 business days. Marcus didn't move for a moment. He was looking at her, not with accusation, with something that was almost, and this was the thing Claire Whitmore would remember later in the months that followed when she thought about this room, something that was almost like grief, like the expression of a person watching something preventable happen. There are people on the upper floors, he said. Security, please escort Mr. Reed out. The elevator systems on floors 50 through 65 run off the same distribution network. If the cascade failure happens, the emergency protocols will lock those elevators in place. If the batteries, Mr. Reed, if the backup batteries are at the charge levels I've been seeing in the logs, they won't hold more than 40 minutes. If there are people in those elevators when the power, that is enough. Claire's voice had not risen. It had done the opposite. It had dropped to the particular register that people who worked for her recognized as the point past which she did not go again. This conversation is over. The 2 security men moved toward Marcus. He didn't resist. He was not a man who wasted energy on gestures. He straightened slightly and turned toward the door. And then the door opened from the outside and Nia walked in. She was carrying her purple backpack and her book with the animal communicating girl on the cover, and she was looking around the room with the wide, cataloging eyes she had inherited from her mother. And she saw her father standing between 2 security guards in a glass room above a city that stretched all the way to the water, and she stopped. Daddy? The room changed. It was not something anyone could have named precisely. It was not that Claire Whitmore suddenly felt differently, not that the security men hesitated for a reason they could articulate. It was something simpler and more devastating than that. It was the presence of a child in a moment that had not been built for children. The nakedness of it, the way a purple backpack looked in a corporate conference room, the way an 8-year-old said the word daddy when she could see from the set of his shoulders that something was wrong. Hey, baby, Marcus said. His voice did not waver. He was, among many other things, a man who protected his daughter from the texture of certain moments, even when she was standing inside them. I thought you were reading. Mr. Hector said you got called to the executive floor, so I came to find you. She looked at the security men. She looked at Claire. She looked back at her father. Are you in trouble? No. He moved toward her and put his hand on the back of her head. We're just leaving. Come on. Why are those men walking with us? Building policy, Marcus said. Come on, sweetheart. Keep your bag on. He walked her to the door. At the threshold, he paused and turned back. He looked at Claire Whitmore for what he believed was the last time. The cooling systems, he said. When they start showing thermal spikes on floors 61 and 62, you have maybe 15 minutes before the cascade begins. Watch the monitoring dashboard. It'll show you a temperature differential greater than 12 degrees between the primary and secondary cooling loops. That's your window. Claire said nothing. Marcus walked his daughter to the elevator. They rode down in silence. Nia held his hand the whole way, which she did not usually do because she had recently decided she was too old for hand-holding except under specific circumstances. Marcus understood that this was one of the specific circumstances. In the lobby, the security escort handed Marcus a form to sign acknowledging the termination. He signed it without reading it. He picked up his daughter's hand again, and they walked out through the front entrance into the San Francisco morning. Nia didn't say anything until they had crossed the first intersection. They fired you, she said. He looked down at her. Yeah. Because of the codes. They said so. She walked another half block. Her sneakers made a precise, rhythmic sound on the sidewalk. Was it really because of the codes? Marcus looked at the street ahead. He thought about a cooling system and a feedback loop and a monitoring dashboard that nobody in a 78-floor tower was watching the way it needed to be watched. He thought about 15 years of work orders. He thought about his daughter and what she was old enough to understand and what she was still young enough to be protected from. Come on, he said. I'll make lunch. We'll figure everything else out after. Nia Reed said nothing more. She held her father's hand all the way home. The building behind them caught the noon sun the way it always did, throwing light back at the city in angles that made it look almost alive. Inside, on the 61st floor, a temperature sensor recorded a differential it had never recorded before. On the 62nd floor, a second sensor followed. The monitoring dashboard in the basement operations center updated silently. No one was watching it. Not yet. The apartment on the third floor of the Tenderloin building smelled like the lunch Marcus had not yet made. He stood in the kitchen with his hands on the edge of the counter and stared at the cabinet above the stove the way a person stares at something they are not really seeing. The pots were where they always were. The cutting board was where it always was. Everything in the apartment was exactly where he had put it, the particular order of a man who had raised a child alone and understood that structure was a form of love. That a child who always knew where things were was a child who felt safe, and that a child who felt safe was something worth any sacrifice to maintain. Behind him, Nia had set her backpack on the chair by the door and was sitting on the couch with her feet tucked under her, the Animal Communicating Girl book open on her lap. But she wasn't reading it. She was watching her father the way she sometimes watched thunderstorms, with the focused, careful attention of someone cataloging information they sensed was important. Marcus opened the cabinet. He reached for the pasta. His hands were steady. He had always had steady hands. It was a quality that had made him a good engineer and a good father, and on a few occasions in his life, a good man in situations that required someone to be steady when steadiness was not the easy choice. "Daddy, mac and cheese or spaghetti?" "Daddy." He turned around. Nia had closed her book, which meant she was serious. She closed her book with the kind of deliberate finality that Diana used to close a conversation she intended to actually finish, and seeing that gesture on her daughter's face, the tilt of the chin, the set of the mouth, hit Marcus somewhere so specific and so deep that he had to concentrate for a moment on the box of pasta in his hands. "What happens now?" Nia asked. He set the pasta on the counter. He came around the island and sat in the armchair across from the couch. Not beside her, but facing her, because she was asking him a real question, and real questions deserved the kind of attention where you looked at each other. "I look for another job," he said. "What kind of job?" "Good one. Same as always." She considered this. "You were good at that job." "I know. You've been doing it since before I was born." "Longer than that. So why did they fire you?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city continued its Saturday business, traffic, voices, the distant bell of a cable car on a street 2 blocks over. He had told her the simplified version in the elevator and in the walk home, and he had meant it to land gently, but Nia Reed had never been a child who was satisfied with the simplified version of anything. She had been asking for the real version of things since she could form complete sentences. And Marcus had always believed, though it sometimes made his life considerably harder, that she deserved it. "They think I was using access I wasn't supposed to have," he said. "Were you?" "Technically, but I was doing it because I was trying to fix a problem, and I had asked permission through the right channels, and I believed it had been given, even though it wasn't properly documented." Nia absorbed this. "And the problem you are fixing, is it fixed?" Marcus looked at his daughter for a long moment. "No," he said, "it is not fixed." "Can someone else fix it?" "If they knew what to look for and knew how to look." "Do they know?" He said nothing. "Daddy, do they know?" He stood up and went back to the kitchen. He filled the pot with water and put it on the stove and turned the burner on. His hands were still steady. "We're having spaghetti," he said, and this time Nia didn't push because she was 8 years old and she understood, the way children understand things before they have the vocabulary for them, that her father had just reached the edge of what he was ready to carry out loud. She opened her book again. Neither of them spoke for 22 minutes. At 12 minutes and 40 seconds, in a server cooling corridor on the 62nd floor of Hartwell Tower, the thermal monitoring sensor recorded a temperature differential of 9.3 degrees between the primary and secondary cooling loops. At 19 minutes, it was 11 degrees. At 22 minutes, the differential crossed 12. The monitoring dashboard in the basement operations center updated. Still, no one was watching. Kyle Emerson had been Claire Whitmore's assistant for 14 months, and in those 14 months he had learned to read the silence of her office the way sailors learn to read water, by the small, almost imperceptible variations in surface tension that told you something was moving underneath. The office was quiet now in a way that meant she was thinking, not reading. When she was reading, she turned pages at consistent intervals, and the silence had a rhythm. When she was thinking, the silence was perfectly still, and if you were Kyle Emerson, 14 months in, you did not knock on that door. He did not knock. He sent an email. It read, "Gordon Pruitt asking if you want updated confirmation that Reed's building access has been revoked." Her reply came back in 4 minutes. Confirmed. "And send me his employee file, full record." Kyle pulled the file. He sent it. He went back to the merger documents that had been his primary focus for the past 6 weeks and tried to find where he had left off, but he kept thinking about the man in the conference room, the quiet way he had spoken, the little girl with the purple backpack. Kyle was 26 years old and had grown up in Ohio and had come to San Francisco because San Francisco was where the opportunities were. And he had taken this job because it was prestigious and because Claire Whitmore was brilliant even when she was difficult, and he had spent 14 months learning how to anticipate her and support her and execute with the efficiency she required. He was good at the job. He knew he was good at it. He also knew, sitting at his desk at 12:18 on a Saturday, that something about the morning felt wrong in a way he could not locate precisely. He clicked open the employee file for Marcus Reed. He read it for the first time. He was still reading when the lights in the building flickered. They didn't go out immediately. That was the thing nobody would remember correctly afterward, how it happened in stages. The way serious failures always do when you understand them from the inside, but always seem sudden from the outside. First the lights flickered, once, like a long blink, and several dozen people across several dozen floors looked up from their screens and monitors and documents with the reflexive alertness of animals sensing a change in pressure. Then the lights held for 4 seconds. Then they went out completely. The effect at 12:23 on a Saturday in Hartwell Tower was not as catastrophic as it would have been on a full weekday. The tower ran a reduced occupancy schedule on weekends, which meant that the approximately 340 people in the building at that moment were distributed primarily across the financial operations floors, the executive suites, and the server management center. But 340 people in a 78-story building when the power fails is still 340 people in the dark, 340 people whose phones immediately illuminate, 340 voices beginning to say things to each other in the particular register of people who are not yet frightened but are paying very close attention. The emergency lighting did not come on. This was the first indication that what had happened was not a standard outage. In a building like Hartwell Tower, emergency lighting was fed by a dedicated circuit, isolated from the main power grid, backed by its own battery array in the basement. In a standard outage, a blown transformer, a grid fluctuation, any of the ordinary failures that occasionally inconvenienced large buildings, the emergency lights would have activated within 4 seconds. The corridor lighting, the exit signs, the emergency panels beside every elevator bank. The corridor lights stayed dark. The exit signs stayed dark. What this meant, for the people who understood such things, was that the failure had not originated from outside the building. It had come from inside. From a point in the electrical network deep enough and comprehensive enough to have taken down both the primary grid feed and the backup circuit simultaneously. In 23 elevators distributed between floors 4 and 67, there was a different sound than darkness. There was a lurch, followed by a mechanical groan, followed by the magnetic brake systems engaging with a series of hard, industrial clicks. The emergency car lighting activated on its own dedicated battery. Small, amber, enough to see by. And in each of those cars, the passengers went from motion to stillness in the span of 2 seconds. And then the intercom systems began buzzing with the automated message that told them to remain calm, that emergency services had been notified, that help was on the way. In the car stopped between the 58th and 59th floors, a woman named Patricia Okafor pressed her back against the wall and looked at the 3 other people in the elevator and said, "Okay, it's fine. These things happen." And she was right. Because these things happened, except that as the seconds stretched into minutes and the automated message repeated for the 3rd time without any human voice replacing it, Patricia Okafor began to feel something she had not felt in a very long time, And that was the specific, weightless terror of being suspended in the air by a system she could not see and could not control. There were 23 cars, 111 people. Claire Whitmore had been in her office when the power died. She was accustomed to solving problems with speed and clarity, and the first 60 seconds after the blackout were exactly that. A rapid assessment of immediate information, calls to building operations, a message to her head of security. She moved with the unhesitating efficiency of someone who treated crisis management as simply another form of execution. She opened her office door. The corridor was dark and quiet. Kyle appeared from his desk with his phone flashlight already on and his expression controlled. "Building ops is not responding," he said. "I can't reach the basement operations center." Security desk. Also not responding. Claire processed this. "Get me Gordon Pruitt." Kyle was already dialing. He held the phone to his ear for a long moment. Voicemail. She moved to the window. 78 floors below, the city was in the bright midday sun, moving normally. Traffic, pedestrians, the ordinary operations of a Saturday, which meant the failure was internal, contained to the building. She turned back to Kyle. "How many people are in the building right now?" "Weekend roster, approximately 340. "Elevators?" "I don't know. The monitoring system is down with everything else." Claire stood in her dark office with the San Francisco skyline bright behind her and performed a calculation that she did not want to make. Then she did what she had always done when the calculation pointed somewhere difficult. She moved toward it. "Get building operations," she said. "Get anyone. I want a head count on trapped personnel. Now." She picked up her own phone and dialed the executive security line. Voicemail. She dialed the external engineering firm's emergency number. It rang 9 times. Someone answered. He was not in San Francisco. He had not been briefed on Hartwell Tower systems in over a year. He was, he told her carefully, not the right person to contact for an active failure of this nature. Claire hung up. She dialed the next firm. While she was dialing, Kyle appeared in the doorway again. His voice was careful and precise, which told her he was managing something. "I've been able to reach 2 security personnel on the 43rd floor. They're reporting that elevator monitoring shows multiple cars stopped on multiple floors. They count at least 20 elevator cars with active passenger indicators. 20 cars, passengers." Claire lowered her phone. 23, said a voice from behind Kyle, and they both turned. It was one of the building's weekend IT technicians, a young woman named Chandra, who had come up the stairwell from the 31st floor, because the stairwells at least still had ambient light from the emergency LED strips on each landing, which ran off a completely independent microcircuit. She was holding a tablet, and her expression was the expression of someone who has just read something that has overtaken her capacity for ordinary reaction. 23 cars, Chandra said. "I was able to pull a partial read from the mechanical monitoring before it went down. 23 cars stopped. Best estimate is 100 to 120 passengers." The office was very quiet. "The backup generator," Claire said, didn't activate." Chandra set the tablet on the desk. "I was on the server floor when it happened. I heard the transfer switch try to engage. It didn't. Something in the control network rejected the activation command. I've never seen that. Can you fix it?" Chandra looked at her directly. "Ms. Whitmore, I run application software for the financial systems. This is not my domain. This is deep building automation. The people who understand this system are—" She stopped. The silence that followed had weight. Kyle looked at Claire. Claire looked at the window. Below, the city went on, unconcerned. "Get me his file again," Claire said quietly. "You're looking at it right now," Kyle said. And when she turned to look at him, he held up his phone. The screen showed Marcus Reed's employee record, which Kyle had been reading when the power went out. "I had it open when the grid died. It cached." He held the phone so she could see it. She looked at the file. The full record, not the summary, not the disciplinary notation. The whole thing. The prior employment section she had never read, the credentials section that had not been relevant to her until now, the section titled Previous Experience that listed 14 years of electrical engineering, systems integration, and building automation consulting. And below that, a single line that Kyle had highlighted without meaning to, because he had been reading it when the building went dark. Reason for role transition. personal, caregiving responsibilities. Claire looked at the line for a moment. Then she looked at the temperature chart Chandra had pulled up on the tablet, the server floors, 61 and 62. The thermal differential was climbing. She thought about a man saying 12 degrees. You have maybe 15 minutes. She looked at the time on her phone. How long ago did the power fail? She said. Kyle checked his watch. 14 minutes. Claire moved to the door. Where are you going? Kyle said. To find Marcus Reed. Getting out of the building was easier than it should have been, which told Claire as she descended 47 flights of stairs, with only the thin emergency LED strips for light, that the failure was comprehensive in a way that went beyond simple power loss. The security checkpoint systems were offline. The turnstiles were not functioning. The lobby was occupied by building security personnel who were managing a small crowd of employees who had been evacuating from the lower floors, and no one had the authority or the system's access to prevent her from walking out through the front entrance into the afternoon sun. She stood on the sidewalk in front of Hartwell Tower and looked at the building. From the outside, it looked exactly as it always had, 78 floors of glass and steel catching the light. No visible sign that inside, 111 people were suspended above the ground in the dark, waiting. She opened her phone and called Kyle. The Tenderloin address in his file, she said. Text it to me. A pause. You're going there yourself. Text me the address. Claire. It was the first time in 14 months that Kyle had used her first name. She stopped walking. His employment file. I read the whole thing while you were in meetings this morning. He submitted 4 work orders about this exact failure. 4. The last one is from this morning. He sent it at 8:52 before his shift started. The sound of the city around her, a bus passing, someone's music, the ordinary Saturday world. The cooling system integration, Kyle continued. He described it exactly: thermal feedback loop, cascade failure across the power management network, elevator systems affected. He wrote it in the first work order 6 weeks ago. In plain language. Claire stood on the sidewalk outside her building with 111 people suspended inside it and felt something she was not accustomed to feeling. It was not guilt, not exactly. Guilt was a private emotion, and this was larger and more structural than anything private. It was more like the sensation of a person who has been standing on something they assumed was solid and has just felt it shift beneath them. The assumption examined and found to be a foundation of air. She started walking. Send me the address, she said. The Tenderloin was 12 blocks from the financial district, which meant that on a normal day, the distance was a 10-minute cab ride, and on a day when you were walking with purpose through the Saturday crowds, it was 17 minutes. Claire Whitmore made it in 14. The building was a 4-story structure with a green awning over the entrance and a line of buzzers beside the door. She found Reed in the directory. Apartment 3C. She pressed the buzzer. Silence for a moment. Then a girl's voice, small, careful, suspicious in the particular way that children of single parents learn to be suspicious of unknown visitors. Who is it? Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second. My name is Claire Whitmore. I work with your father. I need to speak with him. A longer silence. Then a different voice, lower, even. The voice of a man who had been expecting the city to get back to him eventually. Nia, go to your room. A pause, yet the sound of small feet on a wooden floor. Then, what do you want? Claire looked at the buzzer. I need your help. The intercom stayed silent long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. She was already formulating the next thing to say. The argument, the appeal to professional obligation, the honest acknowledgement of the morning, when the door buzzed open. The apartment was small and orderly. She noticed this because she noticed everything, and also because it was the kind of orderliness that told you something about the person who maintained it. Not the sterile, impersonal order of someone who didn't live in a space, but the deliberate, intentional order of someone who had decided where everything belonged and held to that decision because it mattered to them. Books on a shelf arranged by subject. A child's artwork framed and hung at eye level, which was a child's eye level, not an adult's. A kitchen that smelled of something cooked recently and well. Marcus Reed stood in the middle of the living room. He had changed out of his work clothes into a gray t-shirt and jeans. His arms were folded across his chest, not defensively, the fold of a man who was standing at attention, waiting to hear what was worth his afternoon. He looked at her with an expression that she found difficult to read, not because it was complex, but because it was almost entirely without hostility, which was not what she had expected, and which made her feel the weight of the morning in a different way than anger would have. "The building's down," she said. "I know." "You know?" "I heard a city alert on the radio 20 minutes ago. Blackout at Hartwell Tower, emergency services responding." He looked at her steadily. "How many in the elevators?" The directness of it stopped her. He was not asking if she was all right. He was not asking about the merger. He was asking the one question that mattered. 23 cars, she said. Approximately 111 people. Something moved through Marcus Reed's face. Not surprise. Something more like the expression of a person receiving a confirmation they had hoped not to receive. He closed his eyes for 1 second. "The thermal differential," he said. "Where was it when you left?" The IT technician's last reading showed 13.6 degrees on 62. That was 20 minutes ago. He opened his eyes. "How long since the initial failure?" 31 minutes. He was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he uncrossed his arms and walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a jacket. "The elevator backup batteries on this building have a rated capacity of 90 minutes from last full charge. They were at 63% the last time I logged them. That means effective runtime is approximately 57 minutes from the time of failure." He put the jacket on. "Which means we have 26 minutes before the first cars start losing emergency power." Claire calculated. 26 minutes. "The cascade," she said. "Can it be reversed?" "Depends on where it originated and whether the backup generator control circuit can be manually isolated and restarted." He was moving toward the door. If someone deliberately designed this failure, they would have built in a lockout for the automated restart, which means manual override from the basement distribution board. He stopped with his hand on the door and turned back. He looked at her for a long moment. His daughter's bedroom door was closed, and from behind it there was the deliberate, conspicuous silence of a child who is listening to every word. "You fired me in front of my daughter," Marcus Reed said. It was not an accusation, it was a fact, delivered with the same precision as everything else he said, and it landed the same way. Claire Whitmore, who had not apologized professionally in 3 years, who had built her entire tenure on the principle that forward motion was the only productive response to any situation, stood in a small, orderly apartment in the Tenderloin and said something she had not planned to say and had not known she was going to say until it was already in the room. "I know," she said, "and I am sorry." Marcus looked at her. He looked at her the way he looked at a monitoring dashboard, not to judge it, but to read it, to determine what was real. Then he opened the door. "Let's go," he said, and as they moved into the hallway and down the stairs toward the street, toward the city, toward the tower of glass and steel where 111 people were suspended in the dark waiting for someone to bring the lights back, Claire heard the bedroom door open softly behind them, and then a small voice, very quiet, said just 4 words into the empty apartment. "Come back safe, Daddy." Marcus Reed did not stop walking, but his hand found the railing and he held it for 1 step, just one, before letting go. They moved fast through the Saturday afternoon streets, Claire half a step behind Marcus, who walked the way he did everything else, with a directness that had nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with certainty. He knew where he was going. He had always known where he was going. That was the thing about Marcus Reed that nobody in Hartwell Tower had ever bothered to notice, that beneath the gray uniform and the maintenance badge and the 15 years of quiet, unacknowledged competence, there was a man who understood exactly what he was doing and exactly why it mattered. Claire was on her phone. She had been on her phone since they left the apartment building, cycling through the contacts she needed: Kyle, the head of security, the external engineering firms, the emergency services coordinator who had responded to the building alert. She was getting fragments of information, the kind of incomplete, partially panicked reporting that large organizations produced in the first hour of a crisis before someone imposed a communication structure on the chaos. She was that someone. She had always been that someone. "What do we know about emergency services?" Marcus said, not breaking stride. "Fire department has units on site. They're assessing stairwell access to the trapped elevators, but they're telling me the building's mechanical room access doors are electronically locked, and the locks defaulted to closed when the power failed. She looked at him. They can't get to the elevator equipment rooms without cutting through. How long will that take? At minimum 40 minutes, possibly longer depending on the door gauge. Marcus calculated without slowing. That's too long. I know. There's a manual override panel in the basement operations center that can release all the elevator mechanical room locks simultaneously. It runs off the same microcircuit as the stairwell emergency lighting, completely isolated from the main grid. He glanced at her. If your people had read the building systems documentation I included with my third work order, they would know that. Claire said nothing. There was nothing useful she could say to that, and she was not a person who spoke when words served no productive function. She filed it away in the category of things that were true and that she would have to carry, and she kept walking. What's the server floor situation? Marcus said. She relayed what Chandra had told her. The thermal differential, the failed generator activation, the control network rejection of the automated restart command. Marcus was quiet for half a block. Say that last part again. The generator control network rejected the activation command. The transfer switch tried to engage and was refused. Refused. He said the word the way he said all words, without drama, but with the particular emphasis of a person who has just confirmed something they were hoping was wrong. That's not a failure mode. That's a design response. Claire stopped walking. He stopped 2 steps later and turned back. What does that mean? She said. Marcus looked at her with the steady, unlayered directness that was the most unsettling thing about him. The way he made eye contact like he was reading a schematic, and what the schematic said was exactly what the schematic said. Not more, not less. It means the generator didn't fail, he said. It means it was told not to start. The San Francisco afternoon moved around them. A couple passed with a dog on a leash. A delivery truck idled at the intersection. The ordinary world entirely unconcerned. Someone did this deliberately, Claire said. Someone who understood the building's automation architecture well enough to inject a command override into the generator control network before the failure was triggered. He turned and started walking again. Which means this wasn't a breakdown, it was a blueprint. Claire absorbed that for 3 steps. The merger, she said. That would be my first question. She was already calling Kyle. They entered through the service entrance on the south side of the building, which Marcus accessed using a physical key he still had on his person, because Hartwell's security team had confiscated his electronic badge, but had not thought to collect his mechanical key. An oversight that Marcus had anticipated with the resigned accuracy of a man who knew exactly how thoroughly he had been considered before being dismissed. The lobby was controlled chaos. Building security was managing the evacuated employees near the front entrance, keeping them away from the elevator banks, communicating with the fire department units staged outside. Someone had set up a battery-powered lantern near the security desk that threw orange light across the marble floor and made everything look like the end of something. Marcus moved through the space without stopping, heading for the stairwell to the basement, and Claire followed him, and the security personnel who might have stopped them saw Claire Whitmore's face and stepped back. The stairwell to the basement was lit by the same microcircuit LED strips that served the evacuation stairs above, thin, steady amber lines along the baseboards that were enough to see by if you knew where you were going. Marcus knew where he was going. The basement operations center was a large, low-ceilinged room that smelled of electrical conduit and recycled air, dominated by the server racks, monitoring terminals, and distribution panels that were the actual nervous system of the building. The place where everything that happened in 78 floors above was managed, routed, and controlled. It was Marcus's room. He had spent more hours in this room than in any room above the ground floor, and he moved through it in the amber emergency light with the fluency of a man moving through his own home. He went straight to the main distribution board on the eastern wall. Claire stood at the entrance of the room and watched him. He opened the panel and began reading it the way other people read text, fast, comprehensive, his eyes moving across the board with the practiced sweep of someone who had memorized this layout, not as abstract knowledge, but as physical knowledge, the kind that lived in your hands and your eyes and didn't require conscious thought. His fingers moved along the breaker rows without touching, tracing the circuit paths like a reader tracking a line of argument. He stopped. There, he said. Claire moved closer. In the amber light, the distribution board looked like an enormous, complex map. Rows of circuit breakers, terminal blocks, wire bundles organized by color and gauge, labeled in small, precise type that was not designed to be read quickly. Marcus was pointing to a section of the board that was distinguished from the others by what was not there. A gap in the terminal block sequence. A small section where wires that should have been connected to their anchor points were instead bundled and folded back, as if someone had deliberately created a junction that looked connected from a casual inspection, but was not. The generator control circuit, Marcus said. The activation command pathway runs through this terminal block. Someone has physically isolated the command wire and looped it through a false ground. The generator is fully operational, and it has been this whole time. It's just not receiving the activation signal because that signal is going nowhere. He turned to look at her. This was done with access to the distribution board, physical access, sometime in the last 48 to 72 hours based on the way the insulation tape has set. Claire stared at the panel. Can you fix it? In about 8 minutes. He was already pulling the small toolkit from his jacket pocket, the toolkit he had carried every working day for 15 years and had not thought to leave behind this morning. But we have a sequencing problem. If I restore the generator activation circuit and the generator starts while the cascade failure is still propagating through the power management network, we risk a voltage surge that will blow the secondary bus and put us in a worse position than we're in now. He was already working, his hands moving with the careful precision of a surgeon. I have to stabilize the power management network first, which means I need to get to the server floor, HVAC control panel, and manually break the thermal feedback loop before I bring the generator back online. Server floor is 61, Claire said. That's 61 flights of stairs. 60 floors, technically, basement to 61. He looked up from the board. I need someone to stay here and wait for my signal. When I call you, I need you to manually throw 3 breakers in this sequence. He indicated 3 breakers on the board and spoke their designations aloud twice, clearly. Can you do that? Claire looked at the breakers. She looked at him. Yes. He nodded and returned to the terminal block. The room was quiet except for the small sounds of his work, the soft click of wire connectors, the careful movement of tools, the occasional brief testing touch of a circuit probe. Claire stood near the distribution board and watched his hands and thought about competence, about how it looked when it was real, about how different it looked from the performance of competence, which was what most of what she managed in a day actually was. People performing capability in conference rooms, in presentations, in the careful theater of corporate decision-making. What Marcus Reed was doing with his hands in this room was not performance. It was the real thing, the irreducible thing, the thing that either worked or it didn't. Tell me about the merger, Marcus said, without looking up from the panel. Why? Because someone did this to destroy it, and if I'm going to fix a building for someone who did this to destroy a merger, I'd like to understand what I'm fixing it for. Claire was quiet for a moment. It was a fair question, asked without edge, and she answered it the same way. Vantage Capital, $11 billion acquisition. It closes tomorrow afternoon with signing. The deal consolidates Hartwell's asset management division with Vantage's investment platform. It's been 18 months in negotiation. Who loses if it doesn't close? Hartwell shareholders, primarily. The deal is structured to pay a 40% premium over current share price. If it collapses, our stock drops significantly. She paused. And whoever holds short positions on Hartwell's stock profits from that drop. Marcus's hands paused for 1 second, then resumed. Anyone inside the company hold short positions? That would be illegal. I know. Silence. I don't know, Claire said. And then, because he had earned the honest version, I haven't looked. I would look, Marcus said. He stepped back from the panel and examined his work with the focused, brief assessment of a craftsman verifying before committing. Then he turned to face her fully. The terminal block is repaired. Generator is ready to activate on command. When I reach the server floor, HVAC panel, I'll call you. You'll have about a 30-second window to throw those 3 breakers in sequence after I break the thermal loop. If you do it in the right order, the generator activates clean and the power management network restores without a surge. His eyes were level on hers. Don't throw them before I call. If the thermal loop is still active when the generator starts... I understand, she said. He held her gaze for one more moment, not for reassurance, for verification, ensuring that what he was placing in her hands would be held correctly. The elevator mechanical room locks, he said. The manual override panel is the gray cabinet on the north wall. Open it and flip the main toggle before you do anything with the breakers. That releases all the mechanical room doors so the fire department can reach the cars. Do that first. North wall. Gray cabinet. Toggle first. Then wait for my call. I'll be here. Marcus picked up his toolkit and moved to the stairwell door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her one more time, and his expression was difficult to name. Not dramatic, not resolved, not any of the things a person's expression was in the movies when they were about to do the significant thing. It was simply the expression of a man who knew what needed to be done and was doing it. Marcus, Claire said. He waited. The battery estimate. 26 minutes from when you left the apartment. How long ago was that? He checked his watch. 18 minutes. 8 minutes left. He went through the door. Shut. 60 flights of stairs. In the amber underlight of the emergency strips, the stairwell was a long concrete corridor that folded back on itself every floor, the same geometry repeated 60 times with minor variations. A door number changing, the occasional scuff mark on the wall, the sound of the city muffled and then absent as he rose above the street-level noise and entered the pure internal quiet of a building that was holding its breath. Marcus climbed fast, not running. Running was for people who panicked, and Marcus Reed had made a decision somewhere in his early 30s after Diana died and he had learned what real emergency felt like. The panic was a luxury he could not afford and did not want. He climbed with the focused, rhythmic intensity of a man who was counting and calculating simultaneously. His own pace, the floors, the time, the sequence of actions waiting for him at the top. On the 33rd floor landing, he passed a group of 4 employees making their way down, guided by one of the security team members with a flashlight. They looked at him, going up while everyone else was going down, with the particular confusion of people in a crisis encountering something that doesn't fit the pattern. Building maintenance, he said, without breaking stride. Keep moving down. Use the handrail. On the 48th floor, he heard voices through the stairwell door, people in the corridor, probably from the financial operations floors, someone saying something about calling families. He did not stop. On the 59th floor, he paused. He paused because the door to the 59th floor corridor was slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could hear something that was not voices, not movement, but a sound he recognized from the physical memory of having worked in buildings for 15 years. It was the sound of an elevator cable under tension in a car that was not moving. A specific high, thrumming vibration, barely audible, the kind of thing you had to know to listen for. He pushed the door open. The corridor was dark except for the building's ambient light from the windows at either end. The elevator bank was midway down the hall, and at the 3rd car from the left, the door was very slightly open, held that way by something, a bag strap or the edge of a shoe, a fraction of an inch, enough to see the amber emergency light from inside the car. He moved to the door. "Hello, can you hear me?" A sharp intake of breath. Then, "Yes, we can hear you." "Oh, is someone there?" "My name is Marcus Reed. I'm building maintenance. I'm going to need you to stay calm and stay in the center of the car. Do not push against the doors. How many people are in the car?" 3. A woman's voice, steady but stretched thin at the edges with effort. "Myself and 2 colleagues." "Anyone injured?" "No, just..." "How long?" "The battery light has been dimming. How long until..." "I'm working on it," Marcus said. He checked his watch. 15 minutes since he left the apartment. 6 minutes of battery time remaining, by his estimate. "What floor indicator shows on the panel inside?" A brief pause. "Between 58 and 59. We're not at a floor." "I know. That's all right. The mechanical brakes are fully engaged. You are completely secure where you are. The dimming light is expected behavior as the battery depletes. It doesn't affect the brakes. The brakes are mechanical. They are not going to fail." He said the last sentence with the calm, particular authority of someone who meant it to land like something solid, and he heard the breath on the other side of the door change slightly. "I am going upstairs to restore the power. When the lights come back on, the doors will cycle through their normal open sequence. Stay in the center of the car until the doors fully open. Understand? Yes. A pause. Thank you. Stay calm, Marcus said. He stepped back from the door and returned to the stairwell. 2 more floors to climb. He moved. Deck. The server floor HVAC control room was at the end of the 61st floor's northern maintenance corridor, behind a door that required a physical key Marcus still had and an electronic badge he no longer possessed. The electronic reader was dead. No power to run it. The mechanical lock was all that stood between him and the panel. He used his key. The control room was smaller than the basement operations center, a focused space dedicated entirely to thermal management for the server floors. Banks of monitoring screens were dark. The control panels were lit only by the small battery-backed status LEDs that the system used to maintain core function awareness during outages. Marcus moved to the primary HVAC integration panel and read the status LEDs the way he'd been reading them in his mind since he walked out of Hartwell Tower that morning with his daughter's hand in his. The thermal feedback loop was visible in the LED patterns, a cycle of status indicators that was updating on a 30-second interval, a loop that was actively confusing the cooling system's load balancing protocol and generating the escalating temperature differential that had been climbing since before the lights went out. Left uncorrected, it would continue climbing until the server floor cooling failed completely, at which point the automated protection systems would attempt an emergency shutdown of the server loads. A load change so sudden and so large that the building's power management network, already compromised, would interpret it as a catastrophic fault and begin shutting down distribution circuits in a sequence that had no clean end state. Marcus had mapped this exact sequence in his 4th work order, the one he had sent at 8:52 in the morning, the one that was sitting unread in a folder somewhere. He opened the panel access cover. The feedback loop had 3 physical causes, all of which required manual intervention at the terminal level. Not software, not an automated system, but hands and tools, and the specific knowledge of which 3 connections needed to be interrupted, in which order to break the loop without triggering the load redistribution fault he was trying to prevent. It was exactly the kind of repair that looked simple once you knew what to do and was impossible if you didn't. Marcus pulled out his toolkit and started. The first connection took 90 seconds to reach and isolate cleanly. The second took 2 minutes because the terminal block had been over-tightened at the last service. A different technician, different hands. Marcus had seen the markings before and knew it would be stiff. While he worked on the second connection, his phone rang. He answered it with one hand, the other still on the terminal. "I'm not at the panel yet," Claire said. Her voice had the particular quality of someone managing effort in their chest. "The fire department released the elevator mechanical rooms. They're moving now." "Good. Stay at the distribution board. Don't touch the breakers." "I know. I'm not—" "Marcus, there's something else." A pause in which he could hear her breathing, and beneath that, distantly, the sound of the lobby. Kyle found something. He's been running financial analysis on internal accounts. 2 of the executive-level personnel have structured positions that pay out on a significant Hartwell stock drop. One of them is the company's chief legal advisor, Richard Crane. Marcus's hands did not stop working. The terminal block yielded and he isolated the second connection. When were the positions opened? 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks. The same period his work orders had been going unread, his access complaints going unanswered, the cooling system degradation accelerating. The timeline settled into shape in his mind with the grim, clean logic of a circuit diagram. "It was never about my access codes," Marcus said. "No," Claire said. "It wasn't." He moved to the third connection. "Kyle needs to preserve all of that data right now. Financial records, access logs, communication records, everything. Before anyone knows it's been found." "He's already doing it." She paused. "Marcus, the external engineering firm reviews the ones that cleared your work orders. Richard Crane managed the vendor contracts for those firms. The third connection was the most complex. A bypass bridge that someone had installed at some point in the last 6 weeks that was not part of the original system design and was not on any of the maintenance documentation Marcus had access to. It had been added deliberately, invisibly, tucked inside the control panel housing in a position that a routine inspection would not find. Marcus looked at it for 4 full seconds. It was neat work. Someone who knew building automation systems had done this. Someone with access and knowledge and enough time to do it carefully. Not a rushed job. A planned one. He thought about what Claire had said. Richard Crane managed vendor contracts for the external engineering firms, the firms that had reviewed his work orders and found no actionable risk. If Crane had been steering those reviews, if the engineers had been told what to find, or more precisely what not to find, then Marcus's warnings had not simply been ignored. They had been suppressed, actively, deliberately, by someone who needed the building's vulnerability to be a secret until the right moment. That moment was today. The merger signing was tomorrow. The blackout, the trapped employees, the chaos, it was designed to collapse the deal, destroy confidence in the company, crater the stock price. And someone inside the building had spent 6 weeks preparing the ground. Marcus picked up his phone. Claire. Still here. This bypass bridge in the HVAC control panel. It was installed. Someone put it here. That's what accelerated the thermal degradation. This wasn't a maintenance failure. Silence on the line. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Claire said. I'm saying the cooling system wasn't failing on its own. It was being helped. He began working on the bypass bridge. This is physical evidence. When I remove it, I need it preserved. Can you get someone up here? Chandra is in the stairwell. She's been helping coordinate. I'll send her up. Tell her not to touch anything in the control room until I'm done, and tell her to bring gloves. He heard Claire relay the message, heard Chandra's response through the phone at a distance, and then returned his full attention to the bypass bridge. It was wired into the thermal loop using connectors that were designed to look like part of the original installation. Same gauge wire, same terminal type, same label tape. But the label tape was slightly newer in its adhesive quality, the connector threading slightly cleaner than the surrounding hardware that had been in place for 8 years. Marcus had spent 15 years learning to read the age of things in buildings, and this was recent. Carefully, with the precise documentation instinct of someone who had spent years writing work orders that no one read, he used his phone to photograph the bypass bridge in situ before touching it. He photographed the wire routing. He photographed the terminal connections. He photographed the label, the connector type, the adjacent components that established context. Then he removed it. The status LEDs on the panel changed immediately. The cycling pattern that indicated the feedback loop dissolved into the steady state pattern that indicated normal thermal management operation. The cooling system, freed from the artificial load confusion the bypass had been generating, began its automatic recalibration. Across the server floor, Marcus could hear the HVAC units adjusting. A shift in the background sound of the room that most people would not have noticed, but that to his ears was as distinct and legible as a change in music. He picked up his phone. Claire. Ready, she said. The thermal loop is broken. Server floor cooling is recalibrating. You have approximately a 20-second window before the power management network interprets the load change and begins its fault shutdown sequence. He was moving back toward the stairwell door as he spoke, because the next thing he needed to do was also not in this room. Throw the breakers now, in the sequence I gave you. Don't hesitate between them. He heard the sound of the distribution board, the solid industrial sound of large breakers moving. 1, 2. A pause of 3 seconds that felt longer than 3 seconds. 3. For a moment, long enough to matter, long enough to be felt. Nothing happened. The building stayed dark and still. Marcus stood in the maintenance corridor on the 61st floor and listened to the silence and held his breath the way he used to hold his breath before the pancake needed to flip. 12 seconds. The moment between what you couldn't control and what you could. Then, deep in the building below him, the generator started. Not an instant, not a snap of light. A building this size came back on in stages, the power management network sequencing the circuits in the order it was designed to restore them, which took approximately 4 seconds from generator activation to full distribution. 4 seconds in which the sound rose from the basement, the enormous industrial mechanical sound of a system the size of a building returning to life, and then the lights came on. Emergency lighting first, then primary power, cascading floor by floor upward through the structure. And in the corridor where Marcus stood, The overhead lights came on simultaneously with the operational status indicators on every panel around him, and the building that had been a 78-story weight of darkened glass and steel was suddenly, comprehensively, brilliantly alive again. In 23 elevator cars, the emergency amber lighting gave way to the full interior illumination of powered cars, and the mechanical brake systems received the all-clear signal from the restored building network, and the door mechanisms cycled, and 111 people who had been suspended in the dark for 41 minutes heard the precise familiar tone of elevator doors opening, and they stepped out onto floors that were lit and solid and real. In the car between the 58th and 59th floors, the doors cycled open onto the 59th floor landing, and Patricia Okafor stepped out into the light and stood with her hands at her sides and simply breathed for one full moment before anyone around her said anything. In the lobby, the security team heard the building return to power and looked at each other with the mixed, exhausted relief of people who had been managing the edge of something and had just watched it pull back. Someone started giving instructions. Someone else was already on the phone. And in the basement operations center, Claire Whitmore stood in front of the distribution board with her hand still on the third breaker and looked at the panel as the status indicators all went green, one by one, until every indicator in the board was showing operational status, and the board looked exactly as it was supposed to look on a normal Saturday afternoon in a building that worked. She lowered her hand. She stood in the suddenly bright basement room and looked at the panel for a long moment, and then she looked at the north wall gray cabinet that she had opened 19 minutes ago, and she thought about a man who had told her exactly what would happen and exactly what she would need to do, and had been right about all of it. Her phone rang. It was Marcus. His voice was even. Powers restored? All indicators green. Elevators cycling open. Security is confirming. They're saying all cars have opened. A pause. Everyone out. The smallest silence on the line. Good, Marcus said. Marcus. Claire turned away from the board and toward the room's exit, toward the stairwell and the building above her that was now lit and operational and no longer in danger. Kyle has everything, financial records, the modified access logs, all of it. I've already contacted the board. What about Crane? He doesn't know we know yet. A pause. Are you coming down? I'm coming down, he said, but I need 5 minutes first. There's something else in the server floor control room I need to document before anyone else touches it. The bypass bridge, and the rest of it. Whoever installed that bridge had to access this room with a badge. And this building keeps access logs for every physical key panel and every badge reader. Those logs survive a power failure because they're stored on an independent flash system. His voice was quiet and exact. Everything that was done to this building in the last 6 weeks is recorded in those logs. Every door, every access point, every time someone was somewhere they weren't supposed to be. Claire stood at the bottom of the stairwell and looked up at the lit tower above her. That's what you've been documenting all along, she said. Your work orders, your monitoring logs, the photographs. A building tells the truth, Marcus said. You just have to know how to read it. She started up the stairs. Above her, the building rose, lit and breathing, 78 floors of glass and steel, and all the people who held it up from the inside, restored to the ordinary, unremarkable, essential work of being the place where things happened and records were kept, and the truth, eventually, could be read by anyone who knew where to look. Marcus came down from the 61st floor the same way he had gone up, through the stairwell, alone, with the toolkit in his jacket pocket and his phone in his hand and the bypass bridge sealed inside an evidence bag that Chandra had produced from somewhere with the practical resourcefulness of someone who had been useful in enough crises to know what they required. The building around him was fully restored now. The lights were on. The elevator indicators were cycling through their normal operational patterns. The ventilation system had resumed its steady background hum, and the server floor cooling units above him were recalibrating with the unhurried confidence of systems no longer being confused by an artificial feedback loop. The building sounded like itself again. Marcus knew its sounds the way he knew his daughter's breathing, the specific, particular quality of it, when everything was as it should be. He passed the 59th floor landing and thought about the woman in the elevator between 58 and 59. He did not stop. She was out. They were all out. That was the work he had come to do, and it was done. What remained was different work. He reached the lobby level and pushed through the stairwell door into a space that was no longer the controlled near panic of 40 minutes ago. but the organized, procedural aftermath of a crisis that had resolved without the worst outcomes materializing. Fire department personnel were completing their sweep of the elevator banks. Building security was conducting a floor-by-floor check to confirm full evacuation of the lower levels. A cluster of employees stood near the front entrance with the particular, quietly charged energy of people who have been frightened and are now running on the residual electricity of relief. Claire was standing near the security desk. She had Kyle beside her and Chandra behind her, and the focused, precise expression of a woman conducting simultaneous operations in multiple theaters. Her phone at her ear, a tablet in Kyle's hands angled toward her, a running conversation with the head of building security that she paused when she saw Marcus cross the lobby toward her. She said something brief into her phone and lowered it. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you owe them something large and are still in the process of understanding exactly how large it is. "All clear," Marcus said. "Every passenger accounted for according to the fire department sweep?" 111 out of 111, Kyle said. His voice had the particular quality of someone stating a number that had been very recently uncertain and was now settled. 4 people treated for mild anxiety episodes. No injuries, no falls. He paused. The battery monitoring logs you flagged showed the cars lost emergency power on average 11 minutes after the elevators opened. If they had gone dark with people still inside, they didn't, Marcus said. Not dismissively, just cleanly, the way you closed a calculation that had come out correctly. Claire was still looking at him. "Come with me," she said. They went upstairs. Not to the 47th floor with its conference room and its floor-to-ceiling windows and the moment that had happened that morning. A morning that felt, in the way of mornings that precede significant events, like it had happened in a previous week. They went to the 63rd floor, to the network security operations room that Chandra had managed to restore to partial function using the building's primary power, where Kyle had set up what he was already calling, with the dry precision of someone who had been doing focused, frightened work for the last 2 hours, the documentation station. The documentation station was, in practice, Kyle's laptop, and 2 external drives and a secure upload terminal linked to Hartwell's cloud backup system, which was hosted off-site and had been unaffected by the building's failure. On the primary monitor was a financial analysis that Kyle had been building since the moment the power failed, and he had still had his phone and Marcus Reed's employment file cached on his screen. He walked them through it without preamble because Kyle Emerson was 26 years old and had grown up in Ohio and had spent 14 months learning how to distill information for a woman who did not want context when she wanted data. "Richard Crane," Kyle said, "Chief Legal Advisor, Hartwell Capital Partners. 11 years with the company, appointed to the executive team 3 years ago under Gerald Hartwell, retained by the board under your tenure." He clicked to the first document. 6 weeks ago, Crane opened a series of structured short positions on Hartwell Capital stock through 3 separate intermediary accounts. The accounts are legally distinct, but the beneficial owner trace leads back to a holding entity registered in Delaware that has Crane's wife's maiden name as the registered agent. Claire looked at the screen. "How did you find this?" "I use the financial monitoring access I have for merger due diligence. The same access I've been using to verify clean hands on the Vantage side." He clicked again. "The short positions are sized to pay out at approximately $12 million if Hartwell's stock drops by 30% or more. A failed merger announcement, following a catastrophic building failure that injures or kills employees and triggers regulatory review, would reasonably produce a drop of that magnitude or greater." The room was quiet. Marcus stood at the edge of the group, listening with the focused stillness of a man assembling a larger picture from pieces he had been holding separately. "The external engineering firms," Marcus said. Kyle nodded and clicked to the next document. "Crane manages the vendor contracts for Perimeter Systems Group and Allied Infrastructure Consulting, the 2 firms that reviewed your work orders. Both contracts were renewed 6 months ago at significantly above market rates. I found 3 internal communications between Crane and the principals of both firms in the last 6 weeks. The communications are vague enough to be defensible in isolation, but in context, they look like instructions to bury what I was finding," Marcus said. "Yes." Marcus looked at the screen. The communications Kyle had found were brief, carefully worded, the kind of language that people used when they were trying to say something without saying it. References to managing the review timeline, to keeping the pre-merger environment stable. 2. 1. Ensuring the technical assessment reflects the current operational parameters. It was the language of people who had decided what they wanted the answer to be before they asked the question. 15 years. 15 years of work orders going back through that system, and he had known for the last 6 weeks that his warnings were not being read, but had not allowed himself to fully believe that they were being actively suppressed. There was a difference, a significant one. Not reading someone's warnings was negligence. Suppressing them, with people's lives as the collateral, was something with a different name. Who else? Claire said. Her voice had taken on the particular flatness that Marcus had come to recognize as her operating register when she was containing something large. At least 2 others, Kyle said. I have preliminary traces on a vice president in the asset management division and one of the senior directors in corporate finance. The same Delaware holding structure, smaller positions. They were likely brought in as secondary stakeholders, enough participation to ensure silence, not enough to be the architects. He paused. Crane is the architect. Claire turned from the screen and walked to the window. 63 floors below, the city was finishing its Saturday afternoon in the long gold light that came in from the west before sundown. She stood there for a moment with her back to the room in the way that Marcus had already learned meant she was not retreating but processing, running the implications the way an engineer ran a stress calculation, methodically, without shortcuts. The board has to be told tonight, she said, before Crane knows we have this. The board call is already scheduled, Kyle said. I moved it up 2 hours when you told me what you'd found. 40 minutes from now. She turned back. What do we have that is unambiguous, not traces and context? What do we have that is definitive? Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and placed the evidence bag on the table beside Kyle's laptop. Inside it, the bypass bridge, the piece of hardware that had been deliberately installed in the HVAC control panel to accelerate the thermal degradation, to make the building's failure happen faster and more completely than it would have on its own. That, he said, along with the access logs from the badge reader on the server floor maintenance corridor. Every physical entry to that room in the last 6 weeks is time-stamped and ID-stamped. My badge was revoked 3 months before the building upgrade that required new thermal monitoring access, so any entries attributed to my credentials after that date are either errors or fabrications. He looked at Claire. My guess is you'll find entries attributed to maintenance staff that the maintenance staff never made. Kyle was already pulling up the access logs on the terminal. Third entry from the top, Marcus said, looking at the screen over Kyle's shoulder. March 14th, server floor maintenance corridor, 12:47 a.m. Badge ID logged as maintenance staff code 774. He looked at Chandra. Chandra had the weekend duty roster open on her tablet. She checked it without being asked. Maintenance code 774 is assigned to Hector Delgado. He was on leave March 14th through March 20th. So either Hector Delgado accessed a secure corridor while he was on leave in the middle of the night, Marcus said, or someone used his badge code without his knowledge. Or someone modified the log after the fact, Claire said. That too. But log modification leaves traces in the metadata. IT forensics will find them. He straightened. Either way, it points somewhere, and where it points isn't Hector. Kyle was writing. Chandra was writing. The room had taken on the focused, quiet momentum of people who have moved from crisis management into evidence assembly, which was a different kind of work, but no less urgent. There's one more thing, Marcus said. He said it without drama, which was the only way Marcus Reed said anything, but the quality of the room changed the way it had changed in the conference room that morning when he had spoken quietly about cooling systems and elevator batteries. A specific attentiveness that came from recognizing that the person speaking was not speculating. The bypass bridge I removed from the HVAC panel, he said. It was installed by someone with specific knowledge of building automation systems, not a software person, not a financial person. Someone who knew how to read a thermal control schematic and physically modify a distribution circuit to produce a specific timed failure. That's a narrow skill set. He looked at Claire. Crane has a background in corporate law. He couldn't have done this himself. The room held that for a moment. He had help, Claire said. Technical help. From someone inside the building or contracted to it with specific systems knowledge. Marcus picked up his phone. The access logs will show us who was in that room, but it would be worth asking who in the last 6 weeks requested access to the server floor HVAC documentation. Physical copies, system design files, anything that would tell someone how that control panel was configured. Kyle looked at Claire. "Pull it," she said. He pulled it. It took 4 minutes. When the result came up on the screen, nobody said anything for a moment. The server floor HVAC system documentation had been accessed twice in the past 6 weeks through the company's internal document management system. The first access was Marcus Reed 6 weeks ago while compiling the data for his first work order. The second access, 2 weeks later, was logged under a vendor credentials ID that belonged to Allied Infrastructure Consulting, one of the 2 external engineering firms that had reviewed and cleared his work orders. "The firm Crane managed," Chandra said quietly. "Yes," Marcus said. The pattern was complete now, not every detail. There were details that would take investigators weeks to fully reconstruct, but the architecture of it was visible. The shape of what had been done and who had done it and why, as clear and readable as a circuit diagram to the people in the room who knew how to look. Claire picked up her phone and called the board chairman. The board call happened in the conference room on the 63rd floor, with Claire on one end of the table and Kyle beside her with the documentation on his laptop and Chandra on standby for technical questions. Marcus sat at the far end of the table, which he had not expected to do. He had assumed his part in this was over, that the documentation handed off in the story told would be the end of his presence in these rooms. But Claire had looked at him as everyone took their seats and said simply, "Stay." And it was not a command in the way she had commanded things that morning. It was something else. A request. Maybe the first one she had made of him that wasn't built on urgency. The board chairman was a 70-year-old man named Arthur Weston, who had founded 2 companies before joining Hartwell's board and who was, by all accounts, not a man who reacted to information with visible emotion. He listened to Kyle's presentation for 12 minutes without speaking. He asked 3 questions, each precise and to the point. Then he was quiet for a moment. "Where is Crane now?" Arthur said. "His building access shows him checked out at 11:40 this morning, approximately an hour before the power failure," Kyle said. "His cell phone is active based on the corporate account pinging. He's in the city." "Has he been in contact with anyone in the building since the failure?" "One text message to Gordon Pruitt asking for an update on the situation. Pruitt hasn't responded." Arthur was quiet again. "Claire, the merger. The signing is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. The Vantage team has been informed of a building systems emergency. I have not yet characterized the nature of the emergency to them beyond that. Do they have reason to pull out?" "Not if we contain this tonight." Claire's voice was level. "The financial positions Crane opened are damaging if they become public without context. In context, as evidence of a failed internal conspiracy that we identified and are actively prosecuting, they are a different story. A story about corporate governance and the strength of our compliance systems." Arthur said nothing for a moment. Then, "That's a considerable reframe. It's an accurate one if we execute correctly." A pause. "What do you need from the board?" "Authorization to engage outside counsel tonight. Authorization to contact federal securities regulators directly rather than through internal legal, given that internal legal is the subject of the investigation. An authorization to suspend Crane and the 2 secondary stakeholders from all access and communication pending investigation." "You have it. All 3. Another pause. "The building systems issue. The maintenance work orders. Walk me through that." Claire looked down the table at Marcus. Arthur Weston followed her gaze. Marcus met the board chairman's eyes across the length of the conference table. He had sat in rooms like this once, in the engineering consulting years, and the rooms had never intimidated him then either, not because he was indifferent to the people in them, but because he understood that the difference between the people who sat at the table and the people who maintained the building the table sat in was mostly a matter of which kind of work was visible to which kind of person, and Marcus Reed had long since decided that visibility was not the same thing as value. "For 6 weeks, Marcus said, I submitted documented evidence of a developing cascade failure in the building's cooling and power management integration. 4 work orders with supporting data, photographs, and system logs. The work orders were reviewed by external engineering firms whose vendor relationships were managed by the individual, now under investigation for engineering the failure. The reviews were structured to find nothing. My access to the system I was monitoring was then characterized as a security violation and used as the basis for my termination this morning. Arthur looked at him steadily throughout this. You're the one who restored the power? Yes. And identified the deliberate modification to the HVAC control system? Yes. And preserved the evidence currently in front of this board? With the help of the IT coordinator and Mr. Emerson? Arthur was quiet for a moment. He looked at Marcus with the particular assessing attention of someone recalibrating a picture. What is your educational background, Mr. Reed? Electrical engineering, master's from Georgia Tech, 14 years of systems integration and building automation consulting before joining Hartwell. As a maintenance worker. In building maintenance, yes. At a significant reduction from your engineering salary, I would assume. Significant. By choice. Marcus met his eyes. My wife was ill, my daughter was an infant. The hours were what I needed them to be. The conference room was quiet, with the particular quiet that follows the statement of a fact that is also a sacrifice, stated without seeking anything from the stating of it. Arthur Weston looked at Claire. This needs to be addressed as part of the resolution. I know, Claire said, and the way she said it told Marcus that she had known before Arthur said it, that it was already somewhere in the accounting she was doing. Not as a gesture, not as optics, but as the correction of something that was, in the clearest sense of the word, wrong. Mkama. Richard Crane was apprehended by federal investigators at 7:48 in the evening in the lobby of a hotel 4 blocks from Hartwell Tower, where a room had been booked under a corporate account he controlled. He was with another man who turned out to be the principal of Allied Infrastructure Consulting, the engineering firm that had been accessing the server floor HVAC documentation. Both were taken in for questioning. Marcus was not in the building when it happened. By 7:30, his part in the documentation was complete. Kyle had everything. Chandra had certified the evidence chain for the physical items. The outside counsel Claire had engaged was on a call with federal securities regulators, and the carefully constructed conspiracy that had been built around the quiet, systematic suppression of a maintenance worker's work orders was unraveling in the precisely recorded, time-stamped, officially preserved manner of things that were caught by the systems designed to catch them. Systems that Marcus, over 15 years, had maintained with enough care to ensure they still worked when they needed to. He left through the service entrance the same way he had come in. It was past 7, and the day had been long in a way that went beyond hours. He walked the 12 blocks back toward the Tenderloin in the evening air, hands in his jacket pockets, and the city around him was in its Saturday night beginning, restaurants filling up, people moving in the particular way they moved when the week was behind them, and the evening was ahead, unhurried and expansive. He thought about Diana. He did this sometimes when things had been large, not as grief exactly. The acute grief had softened over 8 years into something more like a presence, the way a light that has been in a room for a long time shapes the quality of the room even when you are not looking directly at it. He thought about what she would have said about the day. She had been a woman who found the right thing to say about nearly anything, usually something that reframed the weight of it without minimizing it. He could not know what she would have said, but he thought she would have said something about the building still standing, about 111 people who went home to their Saturday evenings because someone had paid attention when it mattered. He thought that was probably enough. His phone rang. Nia. Daddy, it's past 7. I know, baby. I'm 12 blocks away. Are you all right? He smiled at the sidewalk. She had asked this question the same way since she was 6 years old. Not the way children asked it, not casually, but with the focused, direct attention that her mother had given to questions and that she had inherited completely. I'm all right, he said. Are the people in the building all right? All of them. A pause. Okay. Another pause, shorter. I made the spaghetti. He stopped walking for 1 second. Then, I watched the YouTube video 3 times. I think it's good. I only burned 1 piece of garlic bread. How many pieces were there? 4. So 3 are fine. He started walking again, and something in his chest that had been tight all day loosened, just enough to breathe fully. I'll be home in 15 minutes, he said. I'll keep it warm. He put his phone in his pocket and walked the remaining 12 blocks through the San Francisco evening, and the city was lit the way it always was at this hour. All of it ordinary and irreplaceable. The kind of beautiful that doesn't ask you to notice it, but rewards you completely when you do. 3 things happened in the days that followed that were worth recording. The first happened the next afternoon when the Vantage Capital merger signed on schedule at 2:17 p.m., 29 hours after the lights had gone out in Hartwell Tower. The Vantage team had been briefed on the full situation, the conspiracy, the evidence, the arrests, and had concluded, after a 2-hour call with Claire and outside counsel and their own legal team, that a company that could identify, document, and resolve an internal conspiracy of this complexity within 18 hours of it triggering was a company with functional governance, not a liability. The $11 billion deal closed in a conference room that was lit and powered and fully operational. And the pen that Claire Whitmore used to sign it was the same pen she kept in the right-hand drawer of her desk, the one she had used for 8 years because it wrote well, and she saw no reason to replace things that worked. The second thing happened 2 days after the signing, when federal investigators completed their preliminary review of the evidence Marcus had preserved and confirmed what the documentation showed. A coordinated securities fraud and corporate sabotage scheme involving Richard Crane, 2 allied executives, and 2 vendor principals structured around short positions, suppressed maintenance reports, deliberate system modification, and the calculated endangerment of every person in the building on that Saturday. The charges were significant. The evidence was comprehensive. Marcus's 4 work orders, his system photographs, and the access logs he had identified were central to the prosecution case. 15 years of careful, unacknowledged documentation, suddenly, definitively relevant. The third thing happened on a Wednesday morning, 4 days after the blackout, when Kyle Emerson knocked on Marcus Reed's apartment door in the Tenderloin at 9 a.m. with a letter from Claire Whitmore and an offer that Marcus read standing in his doorway in his gray t-shirt while Naya ate cereal at the kitchen table behind him and pretended not to be listening. He read it twice. Then he folded it and looked at Kyle, who was wearing the expression of a young man who was genuinely unsure how this was going to go and had been thinking about it for the entire 12-block walk. "She wrote it herself," Kyle said. "I know, because I didn't type it." "Tell her I'll think about it," Marcus said. "She said you'd say that." Kyle reached into the folder he was carrying and produced a second envelope. "She also said to give you this one if you said that." Marcus opened the second envelope. It contained a single sheet. He read it. He looked at Kyle for a moment. Then he looked over his shoulder at his daughter, who was extremely focused on her cereal in the way that only confirmed she had heard everything. "Nia," he said. She looked up with the transparent innocence of someone who had absolutely been listening. "What?" "How would you feel about your father having a different job? Same building, different job." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to all things that deserved it. "What kind?" He looked at the letter in his hand. The title on the offer was Vice President of Infrastructure Operations, responsible for all building systems across the company's properties, with a team and a budget and the kind of authority that meant work orders would not go to a folder marked unread. The salary was a number that would not require him to calculate whether to get new shoes before or after paying the electric bill. "The kind," Marcus said, "where people actually fix the problems." Naya looked at him over her cereal bowl with her mother's dark, wide, already knowing eyes. "Did they apologize?" He looked at the letter again. The second letter, the one Claire had sent in case he said he'd think about it, was not the offer terms. It was 2 paragraphs in Claire Whitmore's own handwriting, the kind of handwriting that was precise and controlled, and that took effort to make legible, which meant it had been written carefully, deliberately, the way you wrote something when it needed to be exactly right. The 2 paragraphs said what needed to be said. Not in the way of a person managing liability, in the way of a person who had been shown, in the span of a single day, the distance between who they had believed themselves to be and what the evidence actually showed. "Yes," Marcus said. She did. Nia considered this for a moment longer. Then she went back to her cereal. "Okay then," she said. Marcus Reed reported for his first day as Vice President of Infrastructure Operations on a Monday morning in early April, which meant the city was doing the thing it did in early April, the fog burning off later than you expected. the light arriving sideways through the glass towers of the financial district in a way that made everything look like the beginning of something. He wore a suit, not because anyone had told him to, not because the offer letter specified a dress code, which it did not, because Claire Whitmore had written the offer letter herself and had either not thought about dress code or had deliberately left it unspecified, which amounted to the same thing. He wore a suit because he had decided the night before, while hanging it in the doorway of his closet so the steam from the shower would release the creases, that the occasion warranted it. Not for the building, not for the people in it, for himself. For the version of himself that had spent 15 years being precise and careful and correct about things that nobody bothered to verify, and who was now walking into the building through the front entrance, not the service entrance, on a Monday morning in a suit that fit him the way suits fit people who have earned what they are walking toward. Nia had inspected him at breakfast with the critical thoroughness she brought to matters she considered important. She had walked around him once, adjusted his collar with both hands, and then stepped back and looked at him with the expression she had when something was right. "You look like the VP," she said. "I am the VP," he said. She seemed to consider whether this was the same thing. "Now you do," she said, and went back to her toast. He had walked the 12 blocks. He always walked. The walk gave him time to think, and Marcus Reed had always done his best thinking in motion. Something about the rhythm of it, the way the city unspooled around him at a pace that matched the pace of his thoughts. He thought about the building. He thought about what he wanted to do with the first week. He had a list, not written down, because the list had been assembling itself in his head for years. A running inventory of every system in Hartwell Tower that needed attention, every deferred maintenance item, every vulnerability he had identified and flagged and watched go unanswered. 15 years of careful observation, about to become 15 years of actionable authority. He also thought about something simpler than that. He thought about how a building was a kind of argument, a sustained structural argument that the people inside it mattered enough to be protected, that the systems serving them were worth maintaining, that the work of keeping things functioning was as essential as any work that happened in the floors above. He had believed this for a long time. He had believed it quietly, in the way of people who believe things that the people around them are not paying attention to. He was not quiet about it anymore. He walked through the front entrance of Hartwell Tower at 8:43, and Carlos at the front security desk, not the service entrance, the main lobby, where Marcus had never badged through in 15 years, looked up from his station, and there was a moment between them that was brief and complete. Carlos had worked the front desk for 9 years. He had seen Marcus Reed arrive at the service entrance 5 days a week for most of those 9 years. He extended his hand across the desk and they shook it, and nothing else needed to be said. Marcus badged through and went upstairs. His new office was on the 52nd floor, which was not the executive suite and not the basement, and was, in its own way, exactly right. High enough to see the bay on a clear day, close enough to the building's functional core that he could be where he needed to be in minutes. It was a real office, with a door and windows and a desk that was large enough to spread a full set of building schematics across without having to fold them. Someone had placed a set of building schematics on the desk, which Marcus suspected was Kyle's doing. He was right. Kyle appeared in the doorway at 8:51, carrying 2 coffees with the slightly uncertain energy of someone who was not sure what the new protocol was and had decided to default to the existing one while he figured it out. "Welcome," Kyle said. "Officially." "Thank you." Marcus took the coffee. "How's Claire this morning?" "In the building since 6:30. She has a call with the board at 9 and then the executive team at 10. She wants to see you after the executive team meeting 11:30. Kyle paused. There are 17 people on your new infrastructure team who are waiting to meet you. I scheduled a team introduction for 9:15, if that works." "It works." Marcus sat down at the desk and looked at the schematics. They were the current building drawings, updated to include the modifications from the last system's upgrade 8 months ago. The same upgrade whose documentation had not been properly communicated to the maintenance staff, which was how the cooling redundancy failsafe had ended up incorrectly configured, which was the original crack in the foundation that Crane and his people had found and then deliberately widened. "Kyle." "Yeah." "The 17 people on my team, do any of them know the full story of what happened?" Kyle was quiet for a moment. "The building does," he said. Maintenance crews, security staff, technicians, word moves. They know the basics. The work orders that were buried, the deliberate sabotage, the arrests. They know you're the reason the elevators came back on. Marcus looked at the schematics. Are any of them the people who submitted work orders or flagged concerns that also went nowhere? Kyle's expression shifted in a way that answered the question before he spoke. I can check the maintenance records going back 2 years. My guess is yes. Check, Marcus said, and send me the names before the team meeting. Kyle left. Marcus turned to the schematics and began to read. The team meeting was in the Infrastructure Operations Conference Room on the 52nd floor, a functional space that had been used primarily for vendor presentations and shift briefings, and that had never, as best anyone could recall, been used for anything resembling what happened at 9:15 that Monday morning. The 17 people who made up Marcus's new team were a cross-section of the building's operational backbone: senior technicians from the electrical and mechanical systems divisions, 3 members of the building security technology staff, 2 HVAC engineers, a network infrastructure specialist named David Park, who had joined the company 8 months ago and whose institutional knowledge was recent enough to be useful and whose instincts Marcus had assessed in 4 minutes of watching him read a schematic. They ranged in age from 24 to 58. Several of them had worked in the building for more than a decade. One of them, a woman named Rosa Garza, who managed the emergency systems protocols, had been there for 19 years. Marcus stood at the head of the table and looked at the group for a moment before speaking. He had thought about what he wanted to say. He had thought about it the way he thought about work orders. What was necessary? What was precise? What would actually communicate rather than simply fill space? My name is Marcus Reed, he said. Some of you know me from the maintenance division. Some of you don't. Either way, you know more about this building than most of the people above us in this tower, and that's why you're in this room and not them. He paused. I was hired into this role because the building almost failed last month. Not because a system broke down, because the information about what was breaking down was being suppressed, and nobody in a position to act on it had a relationship with the people who were finding it. He looked around the table. That ends now. My job, as I understand it, is to make sure the work this team does is heard. Your job is to do it honestly, including when what you're finding is something that's inconvenient for someone above you, including me. The room was quiet. Rosa Garza, who had been watching him with the measured attention of someone who had heard a great many speeches from a great many people in 19 years and had learned to distinguish the ones that meant something from the ones that did not, leaned forward slightly. What happened to the work orders? She said, not confrontationally, directly. The 4 you submitted before the blackout. What's the procedure now to make sure something like that doesn't happen again? We're building a new one, Marcus said, starting this week. Every work order this team submits goes into a system that requires a documented response within 72 hours from someone with authority to act, not a review committee, not an external vendor, a named individual with authority. If the response is no action needed, that decision has to be signed and logged with the technical reasoning. No more disappearing into a folder. And if the signed decision turns out to be wrong, David Park said, he said it without aggression, the way engineers asked questions when they genuinely wanted the answer, then the person who signed it is accountable, not the team that flagged it. Marcus looked at him. The documentation system I'm building is designed to protect the people who find problems. That's its primary function. The room shifted. Not dramatically, not the way rooms shifted in movies when something pivotal was said. The way rooms shifted in real life, which was subtler and more durable, a slight forward lean from several people, a change in the quality of the attention, the specific loosening of the guarded posture that people in institutions developed over years of having their observations not matter. Rosa Garza looked at Marcus for a moment longer. Then she sat back. 19 years, she said. Nobody's said that to this team before. I know, Marcus said. That was the problem. At 11:30, he went to see Claire. Her office was as he remembered it from the brief moments he had been in it. Large, ordered, the particular austerity of a space where someone spent serious hours. The schematics that Kyle had pulled for him were the kind of document that Claire herself would have had on her desk at 6:30. They shared that, at least. The desk now had additional items that had not been there before the blackout. A folder marked Federal Investigation, a printed copy of the merger closing documentation with her signature in blue ink on the final page, and a framed photograph that Marcus noticed was new, positioned at an angle on the corner of the desk where she could see it without looking directly at it. He did not look at it directly either, but his peripheral vision was sharp enough to tell him it was a photograph of a woman and a child, which he understood was not something she had kept in her office before, and which told him something about what the last few weeks had recalibrated. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She was standing at the window, which was her thinking position, and she completed whatever she was thinking before she turned around. "The board approved the full infrastructure restructuring," she said. "Your budget is confirmed. HR has the headcount authorization for 3 additional senior positions on your team. I'd like your recommendations by end of next week." "I have them now," Marcus said. She looked at him. "You've been VP for 2.5 hours. I've been thinking about this team for 6 years. He settled the suit jacket slightly. "The 3 positions I need are a deputy systems engineer for the server floor thermal management, a senior electrical specialist for the distribution network, and a building automation analyst with specific experience in cascade failure prevention." He paused. "I'd like to post externally for all 3, but I also want to review the internal applications first. There are people in this building who have been doing work above their job title for years." Claire looked at him steadily. "People like you were." "People like several of the people on my team now, yes." She moved from the window to her desk and sat down, and they looked at each other across the desk in the morning light without the intermediating crisis that had structured all of their previous conversations. It was, Marcus understood, the first time they had simply been 2 people in a room, without the building failing around them or the urgency of something breaking or the unfinished weight of the morning he had taken his daughter home. "The investigation," he said, "moving forward. Federal prosecutors confirmed 3 counts of securities fraud against Crane, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit sabotage, and 1 count of knowingly endangering building occupants, which carries the most significant exposure." She opened the folder briefly and closed it. "Allied Infrastructure's principal is cooperating. His testimony corroborates the documentation from the access logs and the bypass bridge." She paused. "Your photographs from the HVAC control room. The prosecutor called them unusually thorough for a maintenance worker." "I told them I was an engineer." "I know." She said it with the particular precision of someone who had been replaying that sentence in their mind for several weeks. She had been. She had been replaying a great many things: the conference room, the security guards, the purple backpack, the man telling her with quiet, exact certainty that the cooling systems were failing, the way she had said his title back to him like a diminishment, the way he had not reacted to the diminishment, which was, she understood now, because he had been too focused on the building to spend energy on her. "The 2 secondary executives," Marcus said, "suspended pending investigation. Both have engaged personal counsel. HR is processing the separations." She looked at the folder. "Gordon Pruitt." "I wasn't going to ask about Pruitt." "You were going to ask about him eventually." Marcus said nothing. "Gordon wasn't part of the conspiracy," Claire said. "He was negligent. He received the work order notifications, forwarded them to the review process without reading them, and accepted the external reviews without question because questioning them would have required time he wasn't making and attention he wasn't paying." She paused. "That's not conspiracy. That's the particular failure of a person who manages a process without understanding what the process is for." "What happens to him?" "He's been reassigned to a non-supervisory role in facilities administration. It's not a punishment I would have landed on before this." She looked at Marcus directly. "He wasn't malicious, he was absent. There's a difference." Marcus considered this. "There is," he said. "But people were suspended in the dark for 40 minutes because of that absence." "Yes." She did not qualify it. "They were." The office was quiet for a moment. Through the windows, the bay was clear in the April light. "I want to do something," Claire said, "for the people who were in the elevators. Not legal settlement. We've handled that separately. Something different." She had been thinking about this for weeks, since the night of the blackout, since standing in the lit basement with her hand on the 3rd breaker, and understanding in the specific physical way that you understood things when your body had been in them, that 111 people had been suspended in the dark because warnings had been ignored and that the company she ran had been the mechanism of that negligence. I want to do it right. I don't want it to be a gesture. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Ask them, he said. She looked at him. The people who were in the elevators. Ask them what they need. Not HR, not legal, not a committee. You. He met her eyes. You went to my apartment. You can do this. Claire held his gaze for a long moment. Then she wrote something on the notepad beside her keyboard. All right, she said. Kitam. The weeks that followed had a different quality than the weeks before them, and the people in the building felt the difference the way people in buildings always felt changes that came from somewhere structural. Not all at once, not with announcement, but gradually, in the accumulation of small things that added up to a different atmosphere. The most visible change was Marcus himself. Not because he announced his presence, he was not, had never been, a man who filled space with sound, but because of where he went and how he moved through the building. He walked every floor, not as inspection, not as surveillance, but as familiarity. The same thorough, attentive relationship with the building he had maintained for 15 years, now conducted at a different altitude. He went to the mechanical rooms. He went to the network infrastructure closets. He went to the emergency systems panel rooms and the HVAC maintenance corridors and the distribution board rooms and every space in the building where someone was doing work that the people on the executive floors relied upon without knowing it existed. He learned names. He had known most of them already, the maintenance staff, the security technicians, the systems operators. But now he learned them differently, in the context of their work, the way you learned a person's name when you were paying attention to the whole of them and not just the function they performed. A man named Terrence, who had been managing the building's fire suppression systems for 12 years and had sent 6 work orders in that time, about a pressure variance in the secondary suppression loop on the parking structure level that had never been addressed. Marcus read all 6 work orders and addressed the pressure variance in the second week. Terrence looked at Marcus afterward with an expression that was something between gratitude and disbelief, which Marcus recognized because he had worn that expression himself, and he said simply, "It's what I'm here for," and moved on. A woman named Elena, who had worked building security on the overnight shift for 8 years, and had submitted 2 suggestions about the dead zone in the camera coverage on the service entrance level that would have caught the Allied infrastructure consultant entering the building in the early morning hours 6 weeks before the blackout. Her suggestions had been filed and forgotten. Marcus had the camera coverage addressed in the first week. He sent her a note, not through HR, not through the formal system, a handwritten note, the way Claire had sent him the second letter because that was how you communicated when you meant it. The infrastructure team met every Monday morning. The meetings were not long. They were structured the way Marcus structured all things, with precision, without waste, with the specific efficiency of a person who respected other people's time enough not to fill it with noise. Each team member brought their current work orders and active flags. Each flag was responded to in the meeting or assigned a named follow-up. Nothing went into a folder. David Park, the network infrastructure specialist, told Marcus in the 3rd week that it was the first job he'd had where he felt like what he found actually mattered to someone above him. He said it with the slightly embarrassed candor of a young professional who was not sure if saying it was appropriate. Marcus looked at him and said, "It always mattered. We just needed a system where that could get through." David nodded and went back to his laptop. And Marcus understood that this particular exchange, this young engineer with his guard slightly down and his attention fully engaged, was the actual return on the work, not the title, not the office. This, bus. 6 weeks after the blackout, on a Tuesday afternoon in early May, Richard Crane appeared in federal court for his arraignment. Marcus was not there. He had been asked by the federal prosecutor's office whether he wished to attend, and he had said no without needing time to think about it. The evidence he had preserved would speak in that proceeding. His photographs, his work orders, his system logs, the bypass bridge in its evidence bag, and that documentation would say everything it needed to say without him present to watch. He had been a maintenance worker. Documentation was what maintenance workers did when nobody was listening. It turned out documentation was also what courts required when it was time to establish the truth of a thing. In the 15 years of careful, precise, thorough documentation that Marcus Reed had produced in that building were now the evidentiary foundation of a federal prosecution. He was at his desk when the arraignment was happening, working through the building systems review he had been compiling for 2 weeks, a comprehensive assessment of every deferred maintenance item, every submitted and ignored work order, every vulnerability in the infrastructure that had accumulated during the period when the building's self-reporting system had been compromised by the people responsible for responding to it. The review was 412 pages long. He had 2 weeks left to finish it. It was the most thorough document of its kind the company had ever produced, which was not a high bar, but it was the bar he had been handed, and he intended to clear it by a significant margin. His phone buzzed. A text from Kyle. Crane pleaded not guilty. Trial date set for September. Federal prosecutor says the evidence package is, and I'm quoting, one of the most comprehensively documented corporate sabotage cases we've reviewed. Thought you'd want to know. Marcus read the text. He set the phone face down on the desk and went back to the review. At 4:30, Claire knocked on his open office door, which was something she had started doing in the second week, appearing without an appointment, which was, for Claire Whitmore, a significant behavioral adjustment. The first time she had done it, Marcus had looked up from his desk with the brief, instinctive wariness of someone accustomed to unannounced appearances from management not being good news. He had recalibrated quickly. "You heard?" she said. Kyle texted. She came in and stood at the window of his office. His window, the one that showed the bay on a clear day, and today was clear. She stood there the way she stood at her own window, with the particular stillness of someone whose thinking happened when they were in motion that was actually very still. Marcus let her stand. He was not a person who rushed silences. "Do you feel anything?" she said. About the arraignment. He considered the question seriously because she had asked it seriously. "No," he said. "I don't." She looked at him. "I spent 15 years in a building that Crane was trying to destroy," Marcus said. "The building is still standing. The people who were in the elevators went home. My evidence is in a federal court." He turned a page in the review. "That's what I feel. Not about the arraignment, about those things." She was quiet for a moment. "You don't feel angry?" "I felt something like anger on the day it happened," he said. "Standing in that conference room, not because of the job. The job was secondary. Because I knew what was coming and I could see it wasn't going to be heard." He looked up from the review. "That's a particular kind of helplessness, knowing what's wrong and having no path to fix it. That's the thing that was hard." He paused. "I have the path now. That's what I think about." Claire absorbed this in the way she had learned to absorb things Marcus said. Not immediately, not as information to be processed and categorized, but with the slower attention of someone who had spent 3 years managing a company and had recently realized that management without listening was a building without a foundation. You could get a long way on the appearance of solidity before the thing you'd missed came back. "The families," she said, "the ones who were in the elevators. I started the meetings last week, the ones you told me to do myself." "How are they going?" "Harder than I expected." She did not say it with self-pity, with the honest precision of someone reporting a finding. "I've had 8 conversations. 3 of them cried. One of them was angry, not at me specifically, but in the room, and at me by extension, which was fair. One man who was in a car between the 63rd and 64th floors told me that the 41 minutes he spent in that elevator were the 41 minutes he understood what it felt like to have no control over what happened to him." She paused. "He said he thinks about it every time he gets in an elevator now." Marcus put down his pen. "He asked me," Claire continued, "what we were doing to make sure it never happened again. Not what systems we were fixing, not what security protocols we were implementing. He asked me, specifically, who was responsible for making sure the warnings were heard the next time." "What did you tell him?" She looked at Marcus. "I told him there was a man in this building who had been trying to get those warnings heard for 15 years, and that he now had the authority to make sure they were." She paused. "I told him that man's name." The office was quiet. "He asked if you were the same man who was in the elevators," Claire said. "I wasn't in the elevators." "I told him that too. I told him you were in the stairwell." She held his gaze. "He said that was the part of the story he was going to tell his kids." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the review on his desk. 412 pages. Still unfinished, still precise, Still the kind of work that mattered regardless of whether anyone was watching. "How many more meetings?" he said. 43 left. "Let me know if you want company for any of them." She looked at him with an expression that was difficult to name, the way several of her expressions over the past weeks had been difficult to name. Not because they were complicated, but because they were unfamiliar on her face, as if certain muscles were being used that had not been used in some time. "You do that?" she said. "It's part of the job," Marcus said. "The foundation work. It's not always technical." On a Friday in late May, Nia Reed came to the building for the second time. This time she came through the front entrance, not the service entrance. This time she had been invited. This time her father met her in the lobby wearing his suit, and Carlos at the front desk gave her the same two-finger temple salute he had given her in the service corridor months before, and Nia gave it back to him with a seriousness that made Carlos smile for the rest of his shift. She was coming because it was the last day of school before a long weekend, and because her father had said she could come see where he worked now. And because Nia Reed was 8 years old and had spent 45 minutes 6 weeks ago in an empty apartment waiting to find out if her father was coming home, and she had decided that she wanted to see the building that had required that of her. Marcus took her up to his office on the 52nd floor, and she stood at the window with her purple backpack on and looked out at the bay and the bridges and the city spreading out in every direction beneath them. And she was quiet in the focused, cataloging way she was quiet when she was taking something in completely. "This is yours?" she said. "The office, not the view." She considered this. "But you can see it from here. Every day?" She turned away from the window and looked at the schematics on his desk. The building drawings, the system diagrams, the floor-by-floor assessments that she had seen him working on at the kitchen table in the evenings. She walked to the desk and looked at them without touching. She was careful about things like that. "These are the maps of the building," she said. "That's right. Do you know the whole building now?" "I knew it before," he said. "Now I can do something with what I know." She nodded. This seemed to her like the right answer. She went back to the window. At 5:15, Claire Whitmore appeared in the doorway of the office and stopped when she saw Nia. Not awkwardly. The awkwardness of the morning in the conference room with the purple backpack had been worked through in the preceding weeks in the slow, necessary way that things got worked through when people were honest about them. She stopped because the sight of the girl at the window was simply significant, and she gave it a moment. Nia turned. She looked at Claire with the measuring, direct gaze that she had given to everything that mattered to her. Claire met it without evasion, which was, Nia would have been unable to articulate but would have recognized the correct response. "You're the one who fired him," Nia said. "Nia," Marcus said. "No," Claire said. "She's right." She came into the room and stood a few feet from the girl at the window. "I did, and I was wrong to do it. I was wrong about the way I did it, and I was wrong about the reasons I thought I was doing it." She looked at Nia steadily. "I'm sorry. Not just to your father. To you." Nia held her gaze for a long moment. She was 8 years old, but she was also, in some immeasurable and entirely real way, the daughter of a woman who had known how to be precise about important things and a man who had spent 15 years being precise about important things in a building that was not listening, and she brought both of those inheritances to the way she looked at people when she was deciding what she thought of them. "He was always going to come back and fix it," Nia said, not as a question. As a fact, delivered with the particular confidence of a daughter who had paid very close attention to her father. "I know," Claire said. "He just needed someone to let him." The office was quiet. The bay was lit in the late afternoon light, the bridges catching it in long gold lines, the whole city visible and patient and exactly as it was. "He did," Claire said. Marcus Reed's first full systems review was submitted to the board 6 weeks after he started. It was 447 pages long, and it contained in clear, unambiguous language every deferred maintenance item, every unresolved vulnerability, every system that needed attention, and every reason it needed it, with cost projections and timelines, and a risk assessment methodology that David Park had helped him design, and that Rosa Garza, 19 years of emergency protocol experience in her hands, had reviewed and verified. Arthur Weston, the board chairman, called Marcus directly after reading it. Not through Kyle, not through Claire, directly. "I've been on this board for 11 years, Arthur said, And I have never received a building systems document I actually read all the way through. How far did you get this time? Marcus said. A pause. 447 pages. Marcus was quiet for a moment. What do you have questions about? Everything on pages 212 through 240. The load management projections for the server expansion on 63. I'll walk you through it. When? Thursday morning. Thursday morning, Marcus said. He put his phone down and went back to the next review. There was always a next review. Buildings were not static things. They were living systems, changing under load, aging through seasons, accumulating the small incremental variations that turned into the large, consequential ones if nobody was paying attention. Marcus was paying attention. He had always been paying attention. The difference now was that the attention had a name and a desk and a team and a board that would read 447 pages, because the man who wrote them had earned the kind of credibility that did not come from title or tenure, but from being correct about the building when it mattered most. In the 1 hour when everything was on the line and the person who said they could fix it actually could. He worked until 6, which was when he left every evening so he could be home before Nia finished her homework. He took the elevator down, the same elevator bank that had locked and held and opened when the lights came back on, the same mechanical systems he had logged and monitored and worried about in the dark mornings before his shift, now fully restored and running at the specifications they were always supposed to run at. He pressed the lobby button and the car descended with the smooth, unhurried certainty of a system that was working correctly, which was the only way it was supposed to work, which was the whole point. In the lobby, Carlos was finishing his shift. "Good night, Mr. Reed," he said. "Good night, Carlos." He walked out through the front entrance into the San Francisco evening, and the tower behind him caught the last of the day's light and held it for a moment the way it did at this hour. All 78 floors of glass reflecting something from the sky that the ground couldn't see, the way buildings did when they were still standing because someone had held up the part nobody thought to look at. 12 blocks north, in an apartment on the 3rd floor of a building with a green awning, a girl named Nia Reed was at the kitchen table with her homework and a glass of milk and the book about the girl who talked to animals, which she had read 4 times now and showed no signs of tiring of. She heard the front door, and she did not look up from the page, because she had heard it every evening and it always sounded exactly like this. And that constancy was the most important thing she knew, more important than anything she had read or been taught or figured out on her own. "Daddy," she said to the room. "Hey, baby," he said from the door. He hung up his suit jacket and came into the kitchen and looked at her homework and asked how it went. And she told him it went fine, except for the long division, which still made no sense and probably never would. And he sat beside her and walked her through it in the patient, precise way he walked through everything. One step, then the next, with the full attention of a man who understood that the work in front of him, right now, in this kitchen, with this girl, was the most important work there was. Outside, the city went about its evening. The bay caught the last light. The bridges held their weight. And 78 floors above the financial district, in a building that was lit and operational and maintained by people who were finally being heard, the systems that kept everything running did what they had always been designed to do. They held. They held because someone had built them to hold, and because someone had spent 15 years making sure they kept holding, and because in the end, the empires that lasted were not the ones built on the decisions made in the top floor offices. They were the ones built on the people in the basement who knew where to look.